Between drought, the fires, and climate change, Australia is in a very difficult situation, and unfortunately that situation is only going to increase. My name is Bradley Garrett. I'm a geographer, a journalist, and an urban explorer. Australia is an interesting scenario because, you know, it's kind of an Eden, right? It's a wealthy country, the weather's fantastic, everything was going very well. Now, with the threat of climate change on the horizon, Australia is a vastly different landscape. The problem that Australia has is that 86% of the population lives in cities. Those cities are clustered on coasts. Sea levels are rising on those coasts. And at the same time, the center of the continent is 10 great deserts. And aridity is increasing in those deserts. And that narrow band around the deserts where you can grow food, it's burning. So between drought, the fires, and climate change, Australia is in a very difficult situation, and unfortunately that situation is only going to increase. I received a 3-year research fellowship from the University of Sydney to work on this project, and I thought, it might be an eye-opening experience for me. I had no idea that the work that I was going to do there would be so prescient. Some of the things that the preppers were telling me in 2017 when I started the fellowship, by the time I came around to 2019, 2020, it felt like I was live blogging the apocalypse, right? Those things that were speculative suddenly were real. They were suddenly in front of us. Preppers are people who are preparing for various levels of catastrophic scenarios. The real hardcore preppers are building subterranean infrastructure. They're building bunkers that they're stockpiling. And some of those bunkers, people can make it through 1, 3, 5 years potentially underground in the case of a large-scale disaster like a nuclear war. But a lot of preppers are working on a smaller scale. So having a vehicle backed into your carport full of fuel, packed with supplies, ready to go at any time, or simply having a go bag, or what they call a bug out bag, that's just hanging by the door so that if you need to go out at a moment's notice, you can grab it. Most preppers will point to a single event as the thing that triggered their preps, and that was Black Saturday, which was a massive fire that began on the 7th of February in 2009. There were hundreds of fires in the state of Victoria at the time, and they converged into a massive conflagration that burned 800,000 acres, and almost 180 people died. It was the first time that many Australians realized how vulnerable they were, and that as the drought conditions increased in the country, the bushfires would get worse. And of course they have. The 2019-2020 bushfires were 25 times the size of the 2009 fires, and burned an area the size of South Korea. Over 1 billion animals died during those fires, and a lot of what survived is what went underground. So wombats, for instance, that live underground were able to make it through those bushfires. Humans are learning from those animal behaviors, so people are starting to now build fire bunkers in Australia that they're burying on their properties. And these are bunkers that people can take shelter in if there's a fast-moving bushfire coming through their area. So in the same way that doomsday preppers in parts of the world that are threatened by potential nuclear war are building bunkers in their backyards to survive that, preppers in Australia are putting bunkers in their backyard to survive bushfires. You know, if we think about people bugging in, building a bunker, or bugging out, using a vehicle or escaping on foot to get away from disaster, Australians tend to bug out. A lot of Australians have four-wheel drive vehicles that they pack with supplies, and they practice going into the bush, practice deploying their equipment, and often they'll have carry extra fuel with them and extra water so that they can get out of a situation quickly. Preppers in Australia want to get out of cities as quickly as possible. That is the bug out plan. It's to escape the city and get into the bush where they can wait out a disaster. Now, of course, that's being complicated by the fact that the bush is becoming a disaster area, right? So the places that people would have retreated into are now becoming unsafe zones. So people are having to adapt to those plans. I spoke to one prepper in Sydney who has 3 bug out plans. He's got one which involves taking a sledgehammer to an old World War II bunker and getting into that space and then sealing it up where he can lock himself in for a while. He's got a second plan where he escapes on foot and can walk through national parks all the way to the south coast from Sydney. And he's buried small pipes filled with food that he can also use to capture water on the entire walk there. And then finally, he has a boat. So if he needs to escape by sea, if say the land is burning, he can jump in his small dinghy, which is filled with supplies, and make his way off the coast. As I was leaving Australia at the end of my research fellowship, Sydney was on fire. The fires that were burning there burned such a huge area that they created a smoke plume that traversed the entire Earth. The fires could be seen from space. And I flew out of Sydney and I landed in Los Angeles, where I'm from, and Los Angeles was on fire too. I guess the 3 years that I spent in Sydney were a wake-up call to me too. The more I thought about prepping, the more I spent time with people that were building bunkers and working on plans to escape disaster, the more people I talked to who were anticipating disaster, the more I realized that disaster is inevitable. It's something that we all will live with. Climate change, like nuclear war, is very much an existential problem, right? This is a problem that we've created. It's potentially a problem that's catastrophic, and it's a problem that none of us seem to be able to deal with on an individual level. And I think that that's why prepping appeals to so many people now. We're going to have to think about adaptation, and that's the one thing that we can really take away from preppers. They are adapting to future crises. They are anticipating disaster, and they're building for it. And even if we don't want to prep to that level, we can at least start thinking about at what scale we want to respond to these things. There's some level of prepping that we should all be doing. That's what preppers would call practical prepping. And that's something that we should all be thinking about now.